Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the meeting. We will just take one more minute for people to join, and then Lizzie will start.
Lizzie, do you want me to share the PowerPoint from my side, or was Martin planning to do that, or you? Oh, I don't hear you, Lizzie, you're muted.
Sorry. If you could share it, that would be great.
Okay, let me just load that up while we're waiting for Martin to join.
Thanks.
And just checking if you guys can all see the slides in full view mode. Yeah, okay, brilliant. And maybe just a note for Leanne and Hel. I'm having a problem with the chat. It doesn't seem to be loading for me. I don't know if you guys can see the chat, but maybe you can just help keep an eye on it because I don't seem to be seeing anything in there.
No problem.
And Lizzie, just let us know when we're ready to get started.
Sure. Great, I think we're good to go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lizzie. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to see you all today on this call. So welcome to the Global Shelter Clusters Shelter Cash and Markets Community of Practice call. I know it's been a while, I'm sorry, since we've all connected, but we're really excited to be here today. And the call today is going to be focused on hearing about some research that the Global Shelter Cluster led over the last year around how decisions are made on whether or not to use cash in shelter programming. So we've got some presenters with us today. We've got Lizzie and Martin from Habitat for Humanity. We've got Jim, who supported on the research, and we've also got Graziella from SARD, which is an NGO working in Turkey and Syria, who will be sharing an overview of the research itself, some of the findings, as well as some practical experience kind of making decisions on cash and shelter. And then we'll also have some consultation on like what to do next with the findings of the research so that we can translate it into something that is kind of useful for practitioners and accessible as well. So we're hoping to have a really interactive session and hear lots from you all as well in terms of your ideas and reactions to the various presentations today. So to kick us off. Let me figure out how I can switch my slides again. I think we're going to start with a Menti poll. And Hal, shall I hand to you on this one?
Yes, so then you have there your QR code to join through the phone. Otherwise, let me also, just before we open it, see if we can share the link. Okay, so I'll put the link in the chat as well for you, all of you that want to join from your computer. And then I'll share a screen so we can start. So I don't know if Lizzie, if you want to take over on the question and do the analysis on the questions.
Sure, thanks very much, Angel, and thanks for setting this up. Good morning, everybody. My name's Lizzie Babister, and I'm the Global Focal Point for Research and Evidence for the Global Shelter Cluster. The research that we've been working on is all about how you make a decision about how to use cash assistance or other types of modalities in the field. So we're asking you, just to kick us off, if you could give us one cash decision-making criterion in shelter and settlements programming. So how would you do it? Great, so we've got quite a few responses coming out here. Let's see, so whether the markets are working, I think, is coming up quite high. Functionality of markets, market functionality, markets functional. So that's sort of one of the top ones. If the markets aren't working, then it's very difficult to for people to actually use cash for anything. See whether there are skilled people. Yeah, really good point. And we'll see later that it's important to have quite a range of people with different skills, not just shelter and settlement specialists, but people that understand the implications of using cash. Political and local acceptance, great. Yes, so one of the things that we found that we'll go into later is that the political acceptance isn't just the government that you're working with, but also political acceptance within your organisation and other organisations who are working in the field. Just having a look at a few more of those. They keep moving, which is fine, but I'm just trying to follow them with my eyes. Ensure that it's a preferred option for beneficiaries. Great, really glad that we got that one up. Yeah, no point if the donors want it, if the organisations want it, but the beneficiaries are saying, you know what, this really isn't going to work for us, then you know, you've got to make sure that the households are going to be comfortable with the modality that's being chosen. Great, and then quality of available goods, exactly. So no point in having cash if you can't buy anything that's any good, and especially with shelter and settlements where quality is really important because you're making an investment in something which is going to last quite a long time usually. Okay, thanks very much everybody for that exercise, just to get people warmed up, and you'll see we'll go into a few of those later as we make the presentation. So next, you have all these different criteria, and what if everything ticks the boxes and you've got all this lined up, but what are the constraints that would help with, what are the constraints on you making that decision, that cash modality decision? I'll give you a few minutes to put some suggestions up. Right, so I'll just read some of these off here. So yeah, a lack of available market analysis. So again, going back to needing the right skills. If you've got people that can do market analysis, great. But if you don't have those skills, or if you can't access that information, that's going to slow things down. Safety of beneficiaries, great. Yes, so no point in providing cash if it's going to heighten people's insecurity, especially if you're using physical cash that can be stolen quite easily. And then the wider security situation, yes. Bank system cash transfer mechanism is functioning. Yep, absolutely. If there's constraints there in actually the flow of cash, then that's going to be a big constraint. Organizations buy in quickly enough. Yeah, really interesting. One of the things that came out of the research was sometimes your organization is incredibly enthusiastic, almost to the point of saying, well, you know, give us a reason why you can't use cash. And then in other situations, organizations can be quite nervous about cash still, and it can be quite a sensitive discussion to have. So that could be a constraint. Donors or authorities may have set a position that doesn't allow for cash. Yeah, so if you can't get the resources to actually fund a cash programming, that's going to be a big constraint. And then cash misuse, that's a really interesting one. Yeah, so when you've done your market analysis, if you've spoken to households and they're saying, well, actually, and we had this one case where the households were saying, yeah, this may be all working from a technical point of view, but actually, you know, people are not necessarily going to be using the cash for what you are hoping. They're not going to use it on their shelter and settlements because they've got debts and they're going to pay that off first, which is fair enough, but it's not going to be the right thing to support people with shelter and settlements. Great. Okay, thanks very much for that. Maybe we can move on. Oh, sorry, there's a whole lot more. Let me just, sorry, can we just go back just really briefly so we can show everybody the ones that were further down? Is it possible to go backwards? Or is that going to be tricky? That's it. If you could, yeah, if you could just scroll down to is this the bottom ones, just to give everybody a sight of what other people putting up. So yeah, technical capacity can be a constraint. If it's going to do harm, that's going to be a constraint. Availability of cash distribution providers in certain situations. Great. Okay, thanks very much for that. Okay, so just moving on to the actual research itself. The Global Shelter Cluster has a research and evidence function, and one of the things that we did was we asked cluster coordinators what the priorities were for filling evidence gaps. What's the research that they needed to be a lot more confident and comfortable about the strategic decisions that they're making and the advocacy that they're doing on behalf of affected households. And one of the things that came out as top was cash assistance and markets. So the primary objective of this particular research was to increase that confidence, increase the confidence of practitioners in the humanitarian shelter and settlement sector who must choose among different modalities. Next slide, please. So the definition that we took for cash assistance came from CoP. Assistance provided in the form of money, either physical currency or e-cash, to recipients who can be individuals, households, or communities. We chose to look at cash assistance in particular, so distinct from more restricted modalities such as vouchers and distinct from in-kind assistance. Although I would say that one of the primary modalities that came up was actually a mixture of cash, a sort of hybrid approach. But in terms of cash, we are talking about cash assistance or cash, referring specifically to cash transfers. So in this research, cash or cash assistance doesn't mean cash and voucher assistance. Next, please. So our central research question was what the criteria for deciding when and where cash programming approaches are appropriate in support of those who've lost their shelter and settlements in humanitarian crisis, but also what influences these decisions. So we started off with what are these criteria, and that was going to be the research. But what we discovered going forward was that it's not enough to have those technical criteria. And as has come up from some of the things that you've been saying, there are other constraints and things that influence that decision-making process. And so we added on what are also the influences on these decisions. We had 2 additional sub-questions. So how are those decisions actually made? And that showed us what the constraints and influences were. And then, yeah, more widely, what are these major influences on the process? Next, please. Thanks. Methodology was quite straightforward. We looked at shelter sectoral documents that had already sort of general guidance in them around how to choose how to do cash assistance and whether to do cash assistance, although there was less on that. We had cash documents without a specific sectoral focus. That was just sort of general humanitarian documents around cash. There were some academic documents that mentioned cash, and then other documents from humanitarian sectors related to cash, materials, and decision making, but not quite so many of those. So we did this guidance review to start off with to see where the gaps were and what we could take from that related specifically to shelter and settlements. We then conducted key informant interviews. In the end, we managed to interview 21 practitioners, and this was chosen very carefully. We tried to get a real balance of male and female participants. We tried to balance the number of people who had worked as national staff and as international staff. And all of them had experience working in multiple countries in multiple regions of the world, but we did try to cover within that experience a breadth of geographical contexts. So the sampling was done very carefully so that we got a global view. So this research is global. There may be aspects of this research, especially the criteria themselves, where it needs to be contextualized for a particular country or a particular crisis context. Next, please. So the current status of cash and programming in the landscape. What I'm trying to do with this presentation is take you through the document, but we'll share the link to the document itself. There's quite a lot of text on these slides, so I'm not going to go through absolutely everything, but it's just pointing you in the direction of what the different sections of the document are. So we know that actually in the shelter and settlement sector, different actors have been using cash since the late 1990s. So one of the very traditional ways of using cash was a restricted cash phased transfer, where you're, for example, reconstructing houses after a disaster, and there would be a cash payment after households had completed various different stages of their house. So there was some knowledge of cash programming in the shelter sector before cash became much more widespread coming from food security. There's no set of global statistics to indicate overall what percentage of all shelter and settlements programming uses a cash component, but we know that it's quite high and it's becoming higher and people are becoming a lot more interested. And when you have a cluster activated and there's often a sort of cash working group, that's obviously going to influence the discussions that are going on and the percentage of shelter and settlements programming that involves cash. So the interviewees stated that shelter programs with a cash component fell into a number of different modalities, as we just mentioned previously. These could be vouchers for cash, vouchers or cash for essential household items, cash for housing construction, as I've just described, cash for rent, which is becoming quite popular, and also just that traditional cash for work used for improvement of public spaces. We also picked up that there are some key points of tension within the sector, including questions about the uses of multi-purpose cash, often because shelter is seen as one of the most expensive elements of the minimum expenditure basket, and there are ways to decide whether that's a good idea to include shelter in that or not, depending on the context. and also how to ensure construction quality in cash programming. So, like I say, the tradition in the shelter and settlements sector was to use cash in a very structured, phased approach to reconstruction. So, with that sort of concept in mind, then moving to something like multi-purpose cash for something else, there was a tension around how you still ensure that quality, because you are investing in something which is going to be around for quite a while and is, you know, a protection item. It needs to be something which is going to protect people from not just the elements, but give them safety and security. Next, please. So this is just what came up in the guidance review. So what we looked at was gaps in existing guidance and resources around shelter and settlements. So we didn't find clearly defined checklists that we could use for shelter and settlements. There was a lack of a sustained discussion about issues of do no harm. We didn't find that much guidance on how to analyse and quantify the information that was collected. And there was little or no discussion in the national shelter cluster strategies or resources about how to make these decisions. So I won't read them all out, but that's just to give you an idea of what we found. Next, please. So on the left-hand side are the criteria that were existing in the general guidance documents. And then through the interviews that we did, we added in some more decision-making criteria that we felt were sort of more specific to shelter and settlements. So again, I won't read them all out. If you're interested, you can read them in the actual document itself, but I'll read the additions. So with shelter, practitioners were saying that it's important that cash is complemented by appropriate technical support. There should be compatibility with the organisation, cluster and working group policies and the ability to implement or advocate for this decision. There need to be consideration for the location's legal frameworks and practices that impact shelter access for affected populations. And that's not just housing, but also land and property rights. There needs to be a compatibility with the needs of the recovering communities. So sustainability going forward. So a good example of this is rent. If you're going to provide cash for rent for 6 months, what happens next? Although we have recently heard some interesting research that's showing that if you provide cash for rent, then it does help people with their livelihoods, and then there's a possibility that they can then pay their own rent after a certain period of time, which is very interesting. And then lastly, protection for the local environment and natural resources was something which in the shelter sector is very prominent and hadn't really come out of the existing guidance on cash that was out there. Next, please. So the decision-making criteria itself that we pulled out of the guidance and out of the practitioner interviews fell into 5 major themes. There's 12 criteria, which we'll come on to next, but these 5 major themes were the overarching themes that came out. The first one, which many of you pointed out already, the markets and mechanisms can work. That's kind of key, otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. Next, the quality and the resources are balanced. And then implementers are accountable to communities. The power systems are compatible with cash assistance. And then lastly, that the decisions around cash assistance can be sustainable or can make for sustainable planning. Okay, next, please. This was the key answer to the central research question about what are those key criteria for making a decision about whether to use cash or not. And as I say, if you're interested in all of these 12, then do go to the document and have a look through them. But the different colours that you can see here correspond with those different themes. Just give people a moment to look those over. So as you can see, it's about markets, it's about safety for the communities and the humanitarian staff. It's about power systems, it's about the political situation. And it's about all those things aligning and being compatible and ultimately being sustainable. Next, please. So this is how the criteria are explained in the document. So the criteria down the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, there's a definition of how the criteria will be fulfilled, or how you will know that that's going to be fulfilled. It's a bit like an indicator. So for example, take the first one, functional and accessible markets with the capacity to meet demand. And so the definition on how that criteria would be fulfilled would be rental, material and labour markets must have the capacity to meet shelter priorities of affected communities, with particular consideration for local shelter and housing standards and construction practices. So not only does it give you the criteria, but it gives you a definition that can be your sort of objective, and it gives you an idea of sort of what you're looking for in the data you're collecting when you're doing your analysis of making that decision. Next, please. So next we've got the influences on making that decision. The first thing was contextual influences. So the sociodynamics and the geographic setting of a given response and what's happening on the ground. And obviously this is changing as well, sometimes rapidly. So that can impact whether practitioners can attain the criteria necessary to move forward with cash. So you're there with your criteria, you're trying to think, okay, well, which one of these criteria can be fulfilled? And it says the contextual influences must be continually reviewed, because in the first week you might think, great, okay, let's go for it. But you need to sort of review it again after sort of 2, 4, 6, weeks, because the situation is changing, specifically at that point in time early on, where you've got resources pledged but maybe they don't come in, or you've got markets working and then something else happens, which means that that's no longer the case. So contextual influences need to be continually reviewed. Next, please. So next, the sectoral strategy influences. So the strategy that you're setting up and the overall strategy of the cluster and the strategy of the government, they might be context dependent, or they might be part of a general humanitarian strategy. They might call upon core humanitarian standards and principles, but cash assistance has to fit into that overall strategy. So I'm just thinking of an example. If you were linking this with the sphere standards, for example, and the markets were working and you could get hold of the cash, but actually you weren't able to fulfill the sphere standards through a cash approach, then that might be something that needs looking at, and that would influence whether you went ahead or not. Next, please. So this one's interpersonal network influences. So informal professional networks are a key influence that support the practitioner's decision-making process. What we found was that practitioners needed to ask other practitioners in other organisations, they needed to link in with the cluster, they needed to triangulate their knowledge, and that was quite a big influence. And if you're absolutely sure that you've got all your criteria fulfilled and you want to go forward, and yet there are other organisations who are very nervous about cash, then that will influence whether you're going to go forward or not. This is practitioners individually leverage their network of shelter peers to discuss modality decisions and obtain different perspectives, regardless of whether these peers are involved in the current response. So not just people on the ground, but drawing on people in headquarters, other people within the organisation, just to get their perspectives on whether cash might be a good idea. So that seems to be quite an important influence on this decision. Next, please. So the constraints. So the constraints, some of you have brought up already, which is great. So flexibility within donor policies and processes was a big one. So sometimes, as we say, donors are really keen on cash and sometimes they're not, same with organisations themselves. humanitarian agencies. Sometimes they're keen, sometimes they're not. So it's the key is sort of presenting the proposals either to the right donor or being able to sort of explain why we think this is a good idea or a bad idea. Sectoral reflection on lessons learned. There's a desire from practitioners to see more growth in the use of evaluations. So learning and then being more confident from that evidence about what's a good idea or not is quite limited at the moment, which is partly why we did this research. You need to hire the right technical specialists at the right time. So if you've got a lot of cash specialists on the ground, but you don't have any shelter and settlements practitioners, then it's quite tricky to see whether it's going to work for that particular need that's being fulfilled. Type and quantity of data required to make a modality decision. And this is partly why we were saying that you need to sort of go over and review the evidence that you've got and review the context, because that data sometimes initially is going to be really quite difficult to get hold of, and you're going to have to make sort of quite a rapid decision. And then a bit later down the line, you might be able to get more information, but at some point there needs to be a go, no go. So at the moment, people are saying that the type and quantity of data required is not quite enough. Next, please. Further constraints, collaboration between cash and shelter actors. So there's a need to form critical partnerships and develop stronger working relationships with cash actors. And as we've seen, if shelter practitioners are relying very heavily on those informal networks to make a decision, this needs to be done not just in a response, but in between times, from response to response, and building up those relationships so that shelter and settlement practitioners can talk about what's important with cash in that particular sector and why certain things will work or won't work, what are the opportunities, and cash practitioners can inform shelter practitioners on what the specifics are about, you know, how to do it, how to roll it out, how to take those opportunities, and what are the no-go areas, what are the red lines. Multi-sectoral integration at the decision-making stage. We found that there was an absence of clear collaboration on, especially on standards. So again, sort of integrating between sectors, similar to collaboration between cash and shelter actors, to just make sure that everybody has enough information to sort of figure out whether this is going to work or not. And lastly, having enough available and updated training on cash and shelter, which I have to say surprised me because I understand there is quite a lot out there. So maybe it's more about managers making sure that their practitioners are aware of this. Next, please. I'm going to hand over to Martin for the recommendations. Here you go, Martin.
Hi, everyone. So we'll be discussing the key recommendations for donors, humanitarian managers, and practitioners working in shelter and cash assistance aimed at improving decision-making, coordination, and impact in humanitarian settings. So these are segregated by the specific roles and responsibilities that can bring about these improvements. So the first one is for donors, humanitarian managers, and shelter and cash practitioners. So we need to ensure that there are strong avenues of communication between donors and organizations that facilitate advocacy pathways to undertake the most contextually appropriate decision. So there's also a need to ensure that there is appropriate flexibility within proposals to allow for decisions to evolve as the context develops or changes. The second recommendation is focused on strengthening communication and flexibility to directly to humanitarian managers. So it's essential to ensure that there are strong communication channels also. Also with cash expertise, and ensure that practitioners are deployed in a timely manner so that they can support informed decision making in all cases. For our third recommendation, this is for humanitarian managers and meal teams. So this is more having a systematic framework for the use of impact evaluations, and also institutionalizing sectoral learning and retaining knowledge in more visible basis. Next slide. Our fourth recommendation, still for humanitarian managers and MUTE teams, is to ensure that we create flexible and agile programming that accounts for early recovery and intersectoral needs, and do so with a more developed intersectoral understanding about the role and constraints of quantitative and qualitative data collection in time-sensitive decision-making. So ensuring that we have these options as well. Our fifth recommendation is for humanitarian managers, as well as shelter and cash practitioners. So to establish more opportunities, more collaboration, more dialogues between cash and shelter actors, and set clear standards for that collaboration. And then our last type for recommendations for humanitarian managers, make trainings and information on cash and shelter easy to locate and digestible for practitioners. So just having the right context and content. Seventh, for development actors in general, as well as shelter and cash practitioners, the need to develop more comprehensive action plans and how to integrate shelter and cash assistance with sustained recovery for communities. And lastly, generally for shelter, cash, and environment practitioners, we need to expand decision-making around shelter, cash, and the environment to better address environment-related issues when we're doing shelter or settlement programs, including those arising from climate change. Next slide. I think I'll hand over this to Jenny to introduce our sharer for practitioner experience.
Great, thanks a lot, Martin and Lizzie. And just a reminder for everybody to please pop any questions you might have or reactions in the chat as we go. So I'm really happy to have SARD here today, which is an NGO that's been using cash in their shelter programming in multiple countries, including recently in Syria and Turkey. And Graziella is going to be sharing their experiences on deciding to use cash in their response to the earthquake in Turkey last year. So the idea is just to bring a little bit of kind of back to reality. What does this look like on the ground from what we've heard from the findings of the research? So Graziella is an advisor for SARD. She's got a background in hydrogeology and has been working in the humanitarian sector for a number of years. She was at ICRC as a wash engineer for 10 years and then pioneered one of the first cash for shelter programs with NRC in Lebanon in 2006. And she's been working with SARD as an advisor since 2016. So over to you, Graziella, and please just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Thank you, Jenny, for this introduction. I hope I will be able to do it for 5 minutes, my presentation. So in fact, yeah, I'm working for SARD. I actually, let me just give me a minute because I don't have 2 screens. Yep. So yes, SARD is a national organization registered in Turkey, working in Turkey and northwest Syria. And I joined SARD, as Jenny mentioned, in 2016. Basically, what we do in SARD is, I would say, traditional humanitarian work, but since 2016, we try to prioritize cash modality through all our sector, whether it's NFI, shelter, wash, even livelihood, and some of our child protection activities also are done through cash modality. So I'm going to present here what make us move to a cash response in Turkey post-earthquake response. So, I mean, for the post-earthquake, we had to find a very rapid solution that would enable SARD to react quickly and address the need very quickly. We started our response within 3 to 4 weeks of the earthquake through emergency cash. We started with an emergency cash response, and then we continued as early as October, so which is like 7 months to the earthquake, with our first emergency shelter through CVA modality. It was not cash exactly, it was a voucher modality for the emergency cash, and we started our cash response for light repair as early as February last year. I mean, 1 year after the earthquake. Now, what makes us really move to or take the decision to use the cash in our context? It's nothing new than what you have presented, Lizzie, actually, because any cash response, you have to make sure that, yes, indeed, the market availability is there. Indeed, there is a beneficiary preference. There are a lot of notions of security, authority, and etc. So I will try today only to concentrate on the specifics of Turkey. Of course, all the other conditions applies, but in Turkey, I think we had some additional condition. One was certainly to make sure that we continue with a rapid response so that the feasibility is there, and the cash transfer will provide immediate solution as well as empower family to start their recovery without any delay. A very specific context to Turkey earthquake was a psychosocial component. Actually, we had a lot of people living in a camp, having a house which was just only lightly damaged. And the trauma was so big that people didn't dare really to go back to their house. They didn't trust their house. So we also thought that by addressing light damage repair, it was a good kind of combination of acceptance by the authority, but also releasing pressure on a camp by moving or contributing to move out people of light damage house back to their house. So there was, I mean, that was for us, I would say, an important factor of our decision to move to light repair through cash. Another thing is also why through cash is because as the owner of the house, they will be themselves working in the house. So they will be reconciling also with their house, not like through a contractor where anyways they will give again the repair and the relationship with the physical part of the house through a contractor. We believe that this would not have been really impactful for their reconciliation with the house. So the psychosocial component is very specific to earthquake response and was a big, I would say, a big component to our decision to move to cash response. Another, of course, was overcoming the infrastructure damages. I mean, the cash really allow people to go to local market without having to come to the city where most of the aid by the government was provided. So people, there was some functioning local market, but all what people needed was to have access to cash to procure the items in this local market. And this would contribute first to restart also the local market, but also get them closer and having access much faster to materials they may need for the shelter. We also find out that targeting light damage house as well as peri-urban and rural settings was actually bridging gaps of what the government could not be really focusing on. So the government had the capacity to address, I mean, the large scale of this disaster in city, but they didn't have very much capacity to reach out a rural community. Also, there were a lot of minority groups, marginalized groups, they were not necessarily their priority. So it was also for us a good opportunity to show that, look, we could reach out people in rural area and make sure that they stay in the areas that don't come to the city to add additional pressure to the existing camps. Another component for us to to this decision was we really wanted to support recovery and resilience. And we really believe that by transferring cash to the family would really empower them for sure to reinvest in their house, but also, giving them access to cash would really allow them to restart small businesses, restart their own businesses. This is also why we couple our shelter cash response with a livelihood cash component to have a kind of a holistic approach to our response. I think one of the challenge we had in Turkey was around the consultation and the key stakeholders involvement. In Turkey, unlike in Northwest Syria, we have a strong government with a strong capacity, and they really wanted to keep control on their response, rightly. So, and there is not a huge NGO community usually working in Turkey response. There are a lot of NGOs in Turkey working with the refugees, but not necessarily addressing needs of Turkish people. So in the authority, the NGO fora was not super well known. Not to say that we are also a Syrian-led NGO. So, there is a context also where Syrians are not necessarily most welcome in Turkey to help Turkey. But so we found that it was super important for us to have a very tight liaison with the authority. So the first was to convince SAFAD, which is the Disaster Emergency Management Authority, that we were following their regulation, their recommendation, their mandate. We were liaising very closely with the Chamber of Engineers. We were relying on the assessments that they have done, because they have done a damage assessment of all the houses. And they gave us access to the eDevet platform, which is their platform where they registered all the houses, all the level of damage, all the type of intervention / compensation people could have. And they really required us to take our information from this platform and feedback our action to this platform to avoid duplication. So we played, it was a very critical role that we had to play here. Another role that, or liaisons that we had to do very tightly and was very much time consuming was with the municipality. So again, the municipality were not used to NGOs, especially not Syrian-led NGOs. So we had to do a lot of advocacy, a lot of awareness raising, and work closely to the municipality to explain to them that, look, this is a specific type of help through cash, indeed, but we're gonna reach out people that you can't really reach out because they are scattered in rural areas. And we will also release pressure on your urban centers. So there was also, a common interest between SARD and the municipality. So this also enabled us to actually bring some new approach to the municipality and convince them that we are in the same boat. We are also trying to address gaps that they cannot cover. Of course, that was very important for us also to have the right team member. We were talking about human resources. Here, what played a key role for us was to have some workers who understand the humanitarian imperative, as well as understand the Turkish government, the Turkish system. So we were very lucky to be able to employ 2 liaison consultants, former UNDAC staff, who really enable also our access within the authority. And we had to keep very tight updates and transparency with the Ministry of Interior, what we call the Governor Office. So those were the 4 very important liaison and stakeholder involvement we had to do in order to be able to implement this project successfully. I think the very last important things that I would like to share here is one of the reasons we were very much welcomed by both beneficiary and authority was our comprehensive holistic approach. We tried to couple all our action, all our shelter response with a livelihood response and a psychosocial support response for the reason I explained earlier. We also try to make sure, whenever possible, to have an effective, ensure effectiveness of our response by really making sure that we follow the regulation constraints, just to make sure that we are not blocked by the authority. And at the same time, we constantly assess the market to make sure that the market was viable and was able to cater for our shelter response. And also one of the specificity of SARD in this project was to really focus on marginalized population because again, the government had a huge task to cover. They could not cater for all the population. So we really tried to go to hard to reach communities and neglected communities. So yeah, that's what I can say in a very, very short time of our shelter project. And yeah, I'm open for any question. I could talk a lot about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Graziella. And yeah, really nice to see a lot of the themes that we heard from the research globally kind of coming out in how you guys navigated the decision-making process in Turkey as well, and perfectly on time. So thank you, Graziella. Okay, so we've got a little bit of time for some questions and discussion now, either for Graziella on the Turkey program example that she was sharing on, as well as for Lizzie Martin. And we've also got Jim on the line who are involved in the research. So I'm still not able to see the chat properly. So I might hand over to you, Leanne, to share with us if we've got any questions already in the chat, and then others can feel free to unmute or pop additional questions in the chat.
I can answer to the question regarding the damage assessment. The damage assessment. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yes, the damage assessment was actually done by the AFAD, the Disaster Management Authority. So they delegate licensed engineers through all the affected area to do a rapid damage assessment, and we had to refer to this rapid damage assessment. No, Rich was not there. I think it was a very particular context where the authority had the capacity and wanted to keep control on the situation.
Okay, thank you. It was my question. I'm the focal point for technical coordination for the Global Shelter Cluster, and I'm also working on damage assessment. So I'm taking also information also to share, and they will have also link because we will also just would like to inform we'll open the technical community of practice. Then they will have a lot of coordination link with your working group or the working group. So thank you for the information. And my question was because I heard Rich was doing also the damage assessment for Northwest Syria. And so I was wondering, that was the rapid assessment. That was the first data we had. I was also in Syria during this response. And so I was just wondering, because I know also Miyamoto, it's a company who is doing damage assessment. So I was just curious to know if like maybe the authorities were working also with external organization or private sector, but maybe you don't have this information. Thank you.
I think if I may just say regarding the damage assessment, the official legal recognized damage assessment was the one done by the civil engineers mandated by AFAD. Then Miyamoto, they did a lot of training to practitioners and engineers to help them conduct visual damage assessment to be able to do it very fast. What has happened in Turkey is a lot of beneficiaries, a lot of people didn't trust the AFAD assessment because it was done at very early stage, and there were many other shocks after the AFAD assessment. Therefore, they didn't trust it. So they often requested us to do a kind of a counter assessment. Then we use this visual Miyamoto methodology to actually confirm or not confirm the AFAD assessment. If we have the same finding of AFAD, then we intervene. If we don't have the same finding and it's not, we will categorize it medium damage or heavy damage, then we will not intervene and we will send back our assessment to AFAD for information. But then we withdraw because we could not really interfere with AFAD classification.
Okay. Thank you very much for the information. Maybe I can share. I was the other side, so in Syria was even more difficult because they did also damage assessment. They refused any support from also other specialized structure engineer, like the SDC, for instance. I'm member of the SDC, and so it was also even more difficult on the Syria side.
Yeah.
Thank you for this information.
And thanks for the question as well, Pascal.
Yeah, one of the question is regarding the PDM. Did we have completed some PDM? I guess this question is regarding our project. I mean, the answer is of course yes. We did conduct a very thorough PDM and exit monitoring visit, and the result was very positive actually. To our surprise, 98% of the families that we helped through cash grant completed the work as per the BOQ we have agreed. Because, I mean, as you know, and as you mentioned, Lizzie, in the research, cash grant, shelters through cash grant is usually restricted to a very strict BOQ and very strict monitoring of the implementation of the work. We agree on standards, and especially in our case, complying with national standard was a must for us to be able to pursue this project. So we were really satisfied with the result that 98% completed the work. And I don't dare to say, but we had 99% of full satisfaction from the beneficiaries. So we tried to make some counter PDM to get a little bit lower satisfaction and get people to complain for us to learn, but it's very hard. People were quite very satisfied with our project.
Thanks, Graziella. And we do have other questions, but I want to just check whether there's questions for Graziella on this example that you haven't put in the chat. Feel free to open your mic and ask the question. If there's anything else on this one. John has asked, how did you define your CBI intervention? Conditional, restricted? John, I don't know if you want to unmute and say anything about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear me. I'm down in a bunker, but I'd just like to, thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the reference to PDMs, hugely important. I hope the first line in the PDM wasn't cash is good, we want more cash, but that's the discussion for another day. But I'd just like to know, did you define this cash shelter intervention? Was it a restricted cash program, a conditional cash program? Because obviously your program was conditional on the shelter being done and inspections. In many cases, I'm coming across more unrestricted shelter cash programming, which is proving more challenging. So I'd just like to know how you define that from the outset.
So our cash response for shelter is unconditional but restricted. It's unconditional in a sense that we do not ask a beneficiary to contribute or to participate into the injecting some cash into the program, but it is restricted because we have to make sure that we agree on a BOQ, we define a BOQ together, we agree on a BOQ, and they have to implement the repair as per our BOQ. So in that sense, it is restricted. We usually give it in installments. So they do the first installment. We have our monitoring team and our engineers on site all the time to monitor the works before we issue the second installment and the last installment. But it is not conditional, it is restricted.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions on this?
There's a question from Caroline that I think is more.
Yes, I was going to wait until to throw back to you. But that
Sure.
one's for you, Lizzie. But anything else for Graziella before we chat?
Yeah, sorry, it was
Pascal,
again.
go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it was again me on a restriction. Does like the beneficiary have to follow some specific earthquake resistant detail, you know, build back better that's have been developed and for safer reconstruction, and if yes, like who were doing the control? It was your engineers or it was collaboration with the authorities, and I don't know.
That's a very good question, Pascal. Actually, we stay on the safe side. We just go to light damage repair. So
Okay.
and this is why we could not, within this context, at this stage, we could not enter into medium damage houses. We're gonna do it now in a new project. I mean, hopefully with Habitat, if it is confirmed, where we will touch upon medium damage houses. So for sure, if there is some structure repair, they will have to be done as per AFAD and Chamber of Engineer recommendation. Thing is that in Turkey, we have a very strict legal or system to follow. Unlike in Syria, where actually it's even more risky in Syria because we don't have guidelines except for shelter guideline. We have no one to really monitor us and inspect what we are doing. So in Syria, we are more at risk of having quality challenges in the implementation. In Turkey, we are monitored very closely by the Chamber of Engineers and AFAD and the municipalities. They do have all the battery of experts who come and check what we do.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I missed in your presentation, and which tool did you use for the distribution of cash? It was e-car banks, because I can imagine the size of the damage in Turkey was so huge. I don't know how the services were working, so I was just wondering.
In Turkey, we use a bank because the bank was back in business after a week. So we get people to open their bank accounts, so one we didn't have. And we did only bank transfers through IBAN. It's very easy in Turkey. In Syria, though, because we were also doing shelter repair in Syria, we use our financial transfer system to distribute the cash through Hawala.
So like in Turkey, you also provide card for the banks to all beneficiaries.
Only card, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I might then jump back to, we do have one question, and can I throw it to you, Lizzie, with Caroline's question? Got a hand up. Eddie, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very fluid discussion. It's very interesting. Just a follow-up question to the last speaker, because from my experience, while doing bank transfers, so I wanted to learn for like the situation in Turkey, while doing bank transfers where you have to open accounts for affected population members, and sometimes the KYC, the know your customer requirements for the banks are set on limits, and maybe they have some national minimum requirements. Did you face any challenges with having the necessary KYCs, biometrics, or information that were required to open the bank accounts? Did you have special concessions from these banks, or did you have approvals from government to reduce the level or the standard of the KYCs, just to encourage and ensure that the affected population who were eligible for bank transfers could easily access the bank accounts and get their funds? Thank you very much. Over. I hope it was clear. Over.
In our context, you know, in Turkey, bank is widely used and widely common. So we had really no problem for that. It was very easy. I mean, I would say that 75% of our beneficiary already had a bank account. So we were just transferring to their bank account. And the one who didn't have a bank account, it was very easy to open it. And the system is so much in place in Turkey, is very close to what we have in Europe. So we never had any challenges on that, not even to reach out, because actually the bank really went even in the villages to open a little kiosk to actually register the one who didn't have a bank account, because it was not only us transferring money, it was also the government as compensation of their loss. For 1 year, everybody got a certain sum by the Turkish government. So it was, I mean, it was a nationwide move. So we just take advantage of it. Of course, in Northwest Syria, it would be a complete different situation and much more complicated.
Thank you very
Excellent.
much. Very clear.
And Lucy, I'll throw back to you then for Caroline's question.
Thanks, Leanne. I'm just scrolling back to see. So Caroline's asking, in your study, have you looked specifically at the nuances between cash for shelter construction versus cash for non-food items? And I was hoping Jim would be able to chip in on this, but unfortunately he's had to leave. So yes, this came into the criteria around technical support. And I guess I was quite surprised, because I think there seems to be some tension around providing technical support as well as cash assistance. But it really does depend what you're doing. But even if you are providing cash for distribution of non-food items, there's still a level of technical support that you would need there. And it's not necessarily telling people what to do with their cash, which I think is possibly the controversial issue, where we're trying to provide cash to give people more agency. But it's just technical support in making sure that there's an availability of quality goods, or with construction, making sure that the construction is sort of meeting certain standards. So I think in other sectors, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, less technical support is needed, because it's the kind of judgment that you would make yourself. But for example, if you are reconstructing a house that has, for example, you know, reinforced concrete junctions, you're not going to be you're not going to be making those judgments yourself. You know, I'm a trained architect and I've practiced, and I would still want a structural engineer to give me advice on that. If you gave me a load of cash and said, here you go, you know, go hire the labor and manage the construction yourself by, you know, no technical support provided, that would actually be a massive burden for me, and I'm, you know, a trained professional. So I think we need to look at the context there. This leads me really nicely onto the fact that these criteria need to be contextualized, not just because of what you're trying to do with them, but because of the context of the crises, you know, which we've seen with Graziella's excellent description of what they were doing earlier. So yes, we did look at the nuances, but those nuances are also something which are going to be very specific to the context. And when we come to our discussion very shortly about how we actually use these criteria in different contexts, I think that's a really key question that we need to be answering, about what information people need around the criteria in order to make them useful in the field. So thanks, Caroline. If you want to come back on that at all, do feel free.
Yeah, I guess the component that I think is challenging for a lot of practitioners, I think on the shelter construction side, there are many options and ways of going about it, but the shelter sector has the lead, really, very much so, on the construction part. I think things get a bit blurry when we start to talk about non-food items. and relief, because this is where it sometimes overlaps with multi-purpose cash and unrestricted cash. And I think this is where there's a lot of our partners and coordinators struggle to ensure that we have achieved the results we're planning to achieve with cash for non-food items, because of all of these potential overlaps with multi-purpose cash and all the decisions related around it and the coordination related to it as well. So just throwing it out there as a challenge, and I'll be curious to look more in the guidance and on some of the recommendations and maybe further studies required on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Caroline. And I just want to clarify, because I think this will be useful for our discussion, just for people on the call, what is the issue with non-food items as you see it?
That I see it sometimes completely covered by multi-purpose cash, and sometimes only partially, and sometimes not at all. And it just depends really on the context. And so when you are a cluster coordinator coordinating shelter and NFIs and non-food items, it's very hard to draw the line and you know, with multi-purpose cash taking in some contexts more and more space, rightly so. It's a bit hard for the shelter partners to know whether non-food items have been covered through a multi-purpose cash response, and whether it's only partially been covered or not at all. And yeah, I think I can name a number of contexts where there's been quite a lot of discussions there and not always clarity on whether it was entirely covered or not. And then the decision making around what is non-food item, what is shelter, what is wash, what is health. So anyways, I think, you know, it brings up a much larger discussion on NFIs, I think. So yeah, whatever.
Thanks, Caroline. That's a really interesting clarification. Yeah, no, there's definitely a bigger discussion there, which is sort of beyond. This is more about the decision whether or not, but actually you need to take into consideration what's going on with, you know, how an MEB is being set up and how multi-purpose cash is going to be used. So yeah, that's great. Thank you. Gutama, someone else has their hand up.
Well, I was just going to suggest, Lucy, just given the time, if the additional questions maybe could go into the chat and be answered by people, but just to give you and Martin some time have that discussion around kind of next steps, if that makes sense. Is that okay?
Sure. So yeah, if anyone else has any questions, if they could put them in the chat. And I've just seen Leanne has also put the link again to the document of research findings in the chat as well, so it might be useful to refer to that as we go into the discussion. Graziella, did you have something brief before we discuss?
I just wanted to echo one of the comments and what is written on the chat regarding the one of the constraints of the cash response. I think in terms of staffing, this is a big responsibility and a big burden on the NGOs, because actually in order for us to be able to convince the donors that the cash will be rightly used, whether it's cash for NFI, MPCA, cash for shelter, or whatsoever, we need to really convince them with a very tight monitoring, technical monitoring or social monitoring, and have a lot of contact with the beneficiaries to make sure that the cash will be used as we anticipated, as we think or we assess it should be done. But although it's a big pressure on human resources, I think if we invest on that, we can really get assurance that the cash has been used properly, whether it's restricted or not restricted. MPCA usually is not restricted. And the second comment I wanted to say is, you don't necessarily need to have a very good functioning banking system to go to a cash response. I mean, in Syria, we don't have a good banking system, but we use cash since 2016. It's not hard cash, obviously, and it's not a bank card either, but we have e-cards that can be redeemed in shops. There are systems, I mean, parallel systems that can be developed to address a cash response for NFI and PCA, I mean, beyond shelter, I mean.
Thanks, Graziella. That's a really, really interesting point. And thank you very much for your presentation, which I think brought the criteria to life and just sort of showed, you know, how the sort of challenges and constraints that people have in the field, as well as those opportunities. Thanks very much. Okay, so we're going to move into the next part of the discussion, so we've got about 10 minutes. One of the things about research is it's all very well doing it, drawing it up and making a lovely document that sits online. But if we don't share it, it doesn't really have any impact. So one of the ways that we are trying to share this is by telling you all about it, taking you through it so that you can go into the document to find more on what you're interested in. But what we'd really love is for these criteria that came out of the research that these 21 practitioners poured their experience in, to be used in the field. And for them to have an impact, we need to know how we think these criteria should be best presented. So for the next 10 minutes, we're going to consider this question. How do you think these criteria could be best presented that could be useful in the field? And we talked a little bit about contextualizing them. We talked about the fact that the different criteria, some of them might have more weight in some situations than others. So we're going to go into that now. I'm just very briefly going to flick up a few different formats for different types of guidance and tools. Thanks. So here we've got a toolkit or a checklist that could be used. We've got an infographic, which is more like a sort of storyboard. Next, please. We've got different types of sort of interactive guides, you know, something that could be online that you could access that could take you through something in a more interactive way than just a document. Next, please. So what we're going to ask, if you click on the Menti or put the code in, I'm going to ask you, we've sort of narrowed it down to what we might be able to produce. So there's a certain amount of resources available, which is not loads, but we'd like to get this right in terms of the format. If you can go onto the Menti, I'm going to do that myself as well so I can see. Let us know what you think would be the most useful learning formats for these criteria. Are you looking for something that's more sort of written guidelines? Think about what you've used in the past. Were written guidelines useful? Is this something that should be put into a facilitated training? Is this something that we could develop as a module or a piece of a module? And you would actually find it more useful if you were learning this as part of the training. Do you respond better to infographics? If you just had something to refer to in the field, which was sort of graphically presented, is that how you best receive information? Or could this be some kind of self-directed online learning or something interactive that you would like to use? Just think about what you've used in the past, what's been most successful. And we are going to take into account also that one of the things that came out of the research is that people rely on each other, people rely on their peers. Shelter practitioners discuss with those in the field and those that they've known for some time. They rely on their networks to actually take those different perspectives on making a decision as well. So this would be something you would use alongside that, or something you would maybe share with one of your peers who's in the field trying to make this decision about whether cash is the most appropriate modality. So I'll just give a couple more minutes on that. It's quite interesting because written guidelines came top a minute ago, and now more people have voted for facilitated training. And at the moment, we've not got very many people at all interested in infographics or self-directed learning. So this is reflecting on what's been useful to you in the past, and maybe as part of the discussion going forward, if people could give examples of things that have been useful to them, that would be really useful. The written guidelines is edged ahead, so that's looking like the most useful so far. If you disagree, get in there quick, but we will be able to discuss this as well. Okay, if anybody hasn't answered already, then if you could just answer in the next sort of 30 seconds, and then we'll draw that to a close and have a discussion about it. Great. So there we go. Looks like written guidelines and facilitated training at the moment are most popular. Jenny said you have previous discussions in the community of practice of training materials for practitioners on cash and shelter, and that being a bit of a gap. So it could be something that the community of practice looks at again in future, which would be great. Dan said we could combine both written guidelines and facilitated training. Yep, of course. Great. Okay, so we've got a few more minutes now. I wonder if people could give us ideas of written guidelines or facilitated training that they've had in the past that have been useful, that you think could work for the criteria. You can either put your microphone on, or you can make your comments in the chat.
And maybe also, sorry, Lizzie, just to jump in, if people have other ideas beyond the 4 options that we put on the screen, that would be really helpful. I see that Mohammed has also made a suggestion in the chat.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, please do go outside of these 4 options. These are the 4 options that we sort of feel we've got the capacity to deliver. Please feel free to make another suggestion, but obviously if it's a massive suggestion that's going to take lots of resources, we probably can't follow through on it, but we should be able to develop something fairly straightforward. Just picking up Mohammed's comment here, presenting best practices and lessons learned in a review workshop is also a platform for learning, of course. Yeah, we do need to get this on the agenda of various forums and workshops that are out there. Somebody had their
Mohammed also has his hand up. Yep.
Oh, did you want to elaborate on that, Mohammed? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie and Ian, for facilitating this workshop. Super useful always to hear from Graziella and different colleagues, and mainly the findings of the research. Honestly speaking, we have developed for Northwest Syria different guidelines, and the cluster members are fully, let's say, aware of these updated ones, but they still refer when advocating with donors on specific issues. And these guidelines have also worked to guide them on technical part. But honestly speaking, people prefer to participate in a training rather than reading narrative and academic, let's say, researches and guidelines. So that was the major approach we are having. And now we are piloting a new training for cash for shelter for Northwest Syria in collaboration with the global cluster and also global team from CARE. We have also a good practice for Northwest Syria. We conduct every year different sessions on specific topics, workshops, reviews. So for example, the dignified shelter or cash for shelter, we conduct a review workshop where we bring the major cluster members that delivered similar activities, and they have conducted VDMs to refer to their lessons learned, best practices, challenges, and what obstacles. So it's a good platform where we learn and when we communicate specific messages with each other. Specific reports are also conducted for the other members and published for the other members that were not able to participate in these workshops. Just to share those that maybe some choices were not included in the Mentimeter that could be maybe considered in the future. Thank you.
That's great, Mohammed. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And it's really useful to have an example from the ground on how people are learning and how things are being shared. That's great. I'm also seeing in the chat here Elsa is saying, how about a decision tree on the broad criteria for when cash could be used? Understanding a lot of it will be context specific. That's had a lot of likes. Elsa, could I invite you to elaborate on that a bit more?
Hi, yeah, I hope you guys can hear me well. No, I was just wondering, like what I had in mind is actually quite in line with Graziella also said, like a little bit of a checklist, like what needs to be considered and like a little bit the conditions that needs to be met before you move forward to the next step. Like a little bit like, is the market functional? Yes. Okay, it's functional, so okay, you can move to another criteria and then assess another criteria. And then if no, then what do you do in that situation? Or like if you don't know, then what's the course of action that you could take? And some kind of guidance, like basically leading you to the decision of like, yes, you could use cash, or no, probably maybe explore other modalities. Sounds a little bit simplistic, and I don't know how feasible it is, but I think it would be quite useful.
Thanks, Elsa. And I think this is something which would push the criteria a little bit further, because at the moment we have 12 criteria. When you look at them in the document, they're not prioritized at all. But like I said before, they're going to have to be weighted in some way depending on what the situation is in country. Well, you might be able to do that by taking into account, what the opportunities and constraints are. So you might be able to go through those criteria and say, okay, well, of these criteria, which ones are sort of like, easy to tick, and which ones are going to be an opportunity, and which ones are actually constraining us. So, for example, if donors weren't that interested, then that would be a constraint, and that's one of the criteria you have to be able to fulfill. And maybe there's a stage in the process where you actually create your flowchart, based on what it means, what those criteria mean for you in that context. What we don't want to do is sort of make it too complicated for people when they're actually, under a lot of pressure and trying to make decisions quickly. But the criteria on their own aren't going to be enough, I don't think. Somebody else has said in the chat, I think it was Graziella actually, yes, guidelines with the guidelines. So a kind of checklist or tick list of what needs to be considered before engaging in the cash response. So yeah, so what we've got at the moment is these 12 criteria, which is kind of a tick list. You really do have to have all of them, although, as we say, some of them, if you can't, for example, if it's going to cause problems for beneficiary safety, household safety. Don't like the word beneficiary, sorry. If it's going to cause problems for household safety, that might be your red line, and actually you can't move to the next stage of doing your markets assessment, or there's no point in doing a markets assessment if that's the information that you know. And it may well be that that flowchart is just governed by what information you can get hold of first, and then it will tell you what other information you've got to get hold of later on. But this is really useful because this is helping us sort of think through, how these are actually going to be used in the field. Just having a look at the chat again.
Sorry, Lizzie, maybe just to jump in and say we're at time now.
We are. Yeah.
But there's been some really good ideas shared, I think. I don't know, Lizzie, if you want to share any final thoughts before we sort of wrap it up.
Thanks, everyone. Yes, there's going to be the setup of some kind of peer group, working group around this initiative to sort of take these criteria forwards. So if you are interested now, then please, indicate that in the chat. If you're interested at a later date, I'll put my email address in the chat, and you can write to me to let me know. And that would involve mainly reviewing things that we're sending out. So we might sort of come up with an example of what we could do, and then we would want a bit of feedback on that to just let us know whether we're going in the right direction. And then later on, once we've got something a bit more solid, then maybe just people not necessarily testing it in the field, although if people could, that would be great, but just sort of going through it, using it, and yeah, giving us feedback on whether it is a useful guideline or training module or whatever we end up with. Jenny, go ahead.
Thanks, Lizzie. And yeah, maybe just a really quick announcement to say that the Global Shelter Cluster, you may have seen, is hiring kind of a cash and markets focal point to sit in the global support team. So the recruitment for that position is kind of ongoing at the moment. It'll be hosted by CRS on behalf of the cluster. So I'm also hoping once we have that person in place, they'll be able to kind of lead a bit more some of these efforts and take forward some of the ideas that you've all shared, particularly around the training materials, maybe like the checklist format too, in collaboration with Lizzie. So kind of watch this space, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more capacity within the COP to actually, take forward some of these discussions and facilitate, some lessons learned and review sharing sessions as well, like Mohammed had suggested. And then the other thing I just wanted to say before we close is that hopefully the next COP session in the coming months will be around rental assistance. So we've got a couple of presenters already kind of lined up for that. So also watch out in your email inboxes and calendars for an invite in the next few months for the next call on rental assistance. And otherwise, just a big thank you to Graziella, Lizzie, Martin, Jim, who's dropped off, Angel, Leanne, and all of you for joining today. It's really great to see this level of interest and participation, and hopefully we'll kind of continue the discussions as we go forward as well. And you'll all have the opportunity to sort of add your experience and participate as well. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Jenny. Thanks, Leanne.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks,
very
everyone,
much.
for
Bye-bye.
coming.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.